Peace, y'all. My name is Ceci. I use they and them pronouns, and I have the honor of representing BK Rot. We are a youth-powered food waste hauling and composting service operating out of Lenape, Canarsie lands, today known as Bushwick, Brooklyn. Our team of young people collect food scraps by bike and a solar-powered e-trike from businesses, households, community groups, and transform it into compost in public space. Today, we're going to be sharing with y'all a little bit about how we compost, as well as some tips into how do you apply finished compost. Composting makes so much sense. When we think about all of the energy that it takes to produce a leafy green or a fruit, from the sun coming through, literally all of the elements, our fungal friends, the soil, and all of the work that goes in throughout the season from farmers to cultivate this plant into fruition, and we are literally throwing this valuable resource into the trash, when instead we could be finding ways to call them back into the home, into the soil. As a Black thinker and leader, George Washington Carver, said, there is no better plant food than the things we ignore or throw away every day. Carver recognized how waste is something that we made as humans, whereas in his words, nature produces no waste. Whatever is consumed is returned to the whole in a reusable form. He recognized our failure to adopt regenerative practices that feed the soils, which feed us. When we throw out organic material into common systems that end up in the landfill, it contributes to the climate crisis by producing a powerful greenhouse gas, methane. Also, both there and on its way to that site, it contributes to so much local air pollution, which predominantly impact Black and Indigenous and Brown communities, given how racist all of our infrastructure layout is. Composting instead provides a path where we can mirror what is happening in our environment, in ecology and natural systems. Thinking about how the forest reintegrates everything that falls onto its floor back into the soil. And as composters, human composters, essentially our job is to create an environment where our fungi friends and our bacteria friends can thrive so that it facilitates the process. It's wild when I think about in natural cycles, soil scientists say it takes 600 years to generate 6 inches of topsoil. Through composting, we could generate that same amount in 4 months, which is wild. We should all be composting, building up our soils. Composting is also a climate justice solution. So while composting also produces greenhouse gases, it only produces 5% of what would be produced if we sent food waste to the landfill. Compost also has so many properties that help us adapt to the climate crisis. So compost, for example, is great at retaining water, and thinking about that in our soils will support our soils through times of increased precipitation, as is predicted for the Northeast, by supporting the soil and capturing more of that water, preventing more runoff, and preventing or de-intensifying flooding events. And composting will also support through times of drought, as it will support the soils in holding more water, which will benefit our plant and our fungal and our animal kin as well. Composting is also something that lives within all of our lineages. It is something that's been around for millennia, as long as agriculture has been around. And thinking about the Succanescent lands that raised me, the Wampanoag, there had practices of mixing clay with different organic matter to support seedlings in coming up, or they would give small fish onto the areas in which they would plant so that those nutrients would also lift it up. And this is also similar to thinking about other ancestral lands in Tenochtitlan, where the Mexica would take the soil from the lagoon's floor, which had so much decaying organic matter, and build up what people called chinampas, or floating gardens, to grow plants from there, and they would thrive with all of that rich organic matter. from the vermicomposting queen Cleopatra, who declared the earthworm as sacred and forbade its removal. Throughout so many of our different cultures, there are ways in which we have known the power of composting to support our soils and to support us in growing foods. So let's get into how we compost at BK Rot. So at BK Rot, we primarily use a windrow system. And before I tell y'all why I love our windrow system so much, I want to share 5 basic things that are important to creating and maintaining these compost systems. So one is your ingredients. Another one is moisture. Then you have oxygen, and you have the size of the ingredients, and then the size and the shape of the pile or your composting system. I highlight these because windrow composting provides some advantages, honestly, with all of these. So in thinking about a windrow, it's essentially this elongated pyramid. The type of composting that we do is aerobic composting, so it requires oxygen. The form of the windrow, because when composting is active, it produces heat, allows the heat to rise to the top and creates convection heating, so it allows air to be pulled in from the sides, allowing for a more natural airflow through the system. Also, when it comes to moisture, the shape of the windrow essentially helps shed water and distribute it out. Or you could, if your compost is looking pretty dry when you are tending to it, you could alter the windrow to make it concave at the top to allow water to permeate throughout your system, allowing it to get re-moisturized and rejuvenated. And with windrows too, I like them because in bin-based systems, they say that usually the rule of thumb is the food scraps you cut up should be like an inch or so. And with windrows, it's no bigger than your hand. And so you don't have to super go in there. It allows for an easier process when it comes to chopping. And windrow systems can be managed either by machines or by hand. And so they range from in order to be effective to generate the heat, they should be at least 3 feet long, wide, and tall, but they range from anywhere from that to all the way to 100 feet, and those would probably be machine operated. At BK Rot, our windrows are 25 to 30 feet long, and we turn them all just using pitchforks and shovels. So also lifting up George Washington Carver again, because he shares how composting can be done with little labor. I mean, I think it's a lot of labor the way we do it at BK Rot, but there's other ways that it can be less labor intensive. And he also notes how it can be done with practically no cash outlay. So, if we are using the resources that we have to generate this rich material that can help us grow. All right, so now that I went over a little bit of our windrow system, let's go into what we need to compost. So for your setup, you're going to need some tools. You'll need something to chop up the material. So we use ice choppers. Maybe a hoe could be useful, or I've seen people use like machetes or big knives or whatever. Then you also will want some shovels, and a steel scoop shovel is the best because this material can get pretty heavy when you're turning them. And also we recommend having a square shovel, which helps cleaning up the edges, as well as opening up the pathways. And you're also going to want a pitchfork, which is great for moving your browns and also helps in shaping the windrow. And then we'll also want a wheelbarrow to move around the material. And the last thing, if you are looking to sift your compost, then you're going to want a screener, or you can maybe build a trommel that can be powered through a motor and through electricity, or you can create one that's hand turned. And there's also, industrial screeners also that can be attached to tractors or different implements like that too. So now that we have all of our tools, let's go also through the ingredients that we need to compost. So now we get to talk about our ingredients. When we think about our ingredients, it's essentially organic material that we want to use to build up our composting system. As composters, we tend to classify our organic inputs into 2 categories, browns and greens. And for this, I love using this diagram from the New York City Master Composter Manual. So our browns are things that are more carbon rich, and so those tends to be things like wood chips, sawdust, newspaper, leaves, plant material that essentially dried out, and so by that time it contains more carbon. Our greens are things like our food waste, coffee, food scraps, vegetables, fruits, all of these things tend to contain more nitrogen. So they're classified as greens, and this also includes different types of manures, which can be seen as a green as well. And so usually in a composting system, you are going to want to have a 2-to-1 ratio of 2 parts browns to 1 part greens is what's recommended. And so sometimes, you could fill up a whole bin with your greens, and then you put 2 times as much of the browns to make that balance. In windrow composting at BK Rot, we tend to do a 1-to-1 ratio when we're doing the mix, just because we end up adding more browns in the sealing process, which then eventually get integrated into the windrow. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit. Essentially, the size of your composting system and your management is going to depend on the quantity of your inputs as well as the frequency in which you are receiving them. Once you determine that out, that'll impact either if you want a bin system, if you want a tumbler, which is like a smaller household system, or if you want to do a windrow system, you want to make sure that you at least have enough scraps that it can form that 3 feet by 3 feet size. So for windrows, you're going to want an open space for processing, for making the mix, and you're going to also want another open space in which you can build your windrow and have it form. Again, ours are 25 feet long, so that's pretty long. And you're also going to want to have another designated area for your compost to cure. So essentially, after it moves through your composting system, you also then can remove it and put it in an area where it has to sit for, we recommend 4 weeks at least, until it is ready for use. All right, so now that we've gone over all of these steps, let's get into composting. So one method of composting that I love in making the mix is the donut formation, where essentially you lay down your browns, can empty out a wheelbarrow, and then you carve out a space in the center. And we recommend either doing this on plywood, and you can have a tarp on top of the plywood to extend its span, or on a concrete space, a hard surface, so that it allows you to chop up what's in the inside. Then you empty out your greens into the center, making sure to chop up anything. If it's for a windrow, anything bigger than your hand, you should chop up. If it's for a bin system, you should be chopping it up to 1-inch pieces. The smaller the sizes, it increases the surface area, so more decomposers can access them, and it also supports creating a better mix. And then after you have everything chopped up, you can sprinkle some sawdust on top, and then you move around in a circle, shoveling in the browns with the food scraps, and you shovel and flip, and you shovel and flip. And this is a fun thing to do in community, because you can have a bunch of people rotating around in a circle, making sure that everything gets shoveled and flipped 1 or 2 times. How we do it at BK Rot for windrow composting is we usually lay down a bed of browns, and then on top of that, we will also empty out our food scraps, the food waste that we collect, taking out anything that's not compostable, so plastics, forks, etc. You'd be surprised at everything we find in our food waste collections. And after this, what we do is we do a 1 time of a shovel flip, and then we take that same scoop and we flip it onto the windrow build. And for building a windrow, you're going to be wanting to add it essentially to one main central point and just continue adding onto that top, and it'll automatically form a shape of a pyramid. If you are adding to a windrow system that's already built, you're going to want to make sure that you are adding it so that it can stay in line and in shape with the rest of the windrow. So this works best in a team of 2 that is well coordinated, so that someone is placing one onto one side of the windrow and the other person on the opposite side is placing it towards the other side. And so it kind of looks like this crisscrossing motion of each person adding to the other side, and that helps build up the shape. And it's not just as it gets taller, you don't just throw it on or toss it on. You're really placing it with the shovel in order to maintain that space. Once your main shape is done of your fresh food scraps processing, so all of this mix, this 1-to-1 ratio, then you want to cap it or seal it with a thick layer of wood chips. We recommend doing a foot. And what this is going to do is it's going to deter pests from coming in. It'll also create kind of this insulation, allowing everything in the center to reach those higher levels of heat in the beginning stage. And then later on, after 2 weeks, you will turn that section, and then all of those wood chips will be able to integrate into it, supporting to get more of that 2-to-1 balance or a more woody composting system. In taking care of your windrow system, you're going to want to work from the back to the front. It's always best tools-wise. Older material has been breaking down for longer, and so you don't really want to introduce newer or fresh things into it. It's also something that supports with, controlling pathogens or different things, making sure that you're working from old to new. And so the first thing you would do is at BK Rot, each section that we process, each batch, we mark with a wooden plank leaning against the windrow. And so when we're working with the oldest section, and composting gets smaller and smaller in size, so you'll notice that our end sections, the oldest sections, are maybe a third to a half of what they were when we first started. We will take that section, moving it with wheelbarrows and placing it onto our curing pad, where it will sit for 4 weeks until we can then sift it or distribute it for use. So once we clear out that back section of the windrow, we can start working section by section to move it down into the space where the section right before it was. And in this process, it's so important to create clear lines and distinct lines so that you can that accompany the markers, so that we're sure that we're not integrating something that is 4 weeks old with something that's only 2 weeks old, for example. And so in moving the compost, it's kind of the same thing as like the windrow build, in which you're going to be adding it to a center point. And again, to reach those higher heights in windrow composting, you'll use the pitchfork to make a shelf and continue adding it on top. And it's important as much as possible to create this straight line and to create that pyramid shape. And honestly, the best way to do this is by practice. A good thing to support in creating that straight line is you can look at the base of the windrow. And so essentially with windrows, they will be as tall as they are wide. And so if you look at the width of the side, you can essentially visualize or draw a straight line down, and the compost should only be going out to that amount. And then you can continue adding to the top, using the pitchfork to create those shelves and adding on and making sure you're maintaining the slope. So essentially we move section by section down, and we will do this. Each windrow gets turned every other week. So since we have 2 windrows, it means we're turning on a weekly basis. And other composting systems, maybe you'd want to turn them once a week. We do once every 2 weeks is sufficient with our windrows, and especially because, again, that formation is supporting with some of the airflow. Now let's talk about the application phase. And so in creating, in using compost, you're going to want to make a compost soil mix, or you're going to want to use compost to amend soil that's already there. You could either use sifted compost, which again, you would have to use a screener or a trommel to sift it through, or there's also so many benefits to unsifted compost, especially if you are looking to compost a large area, or it can act as a type of mulch, or if you are growing in beds, you can use that mixture to bulk up your beds and mixing it with soil. Also, plants love more complex soil structures, and so adding unsifted compost creates for more soil complexity, allows for pockets for air as well. And sifted compost as well will allow for that. And you want to place unsifted more towards the bottom of the bed where the roots are and can be like sturdier or as they grow deeper. Definitely in the higher surfaces, we would more so recommend, unless you're doing the mulch covering, but where the plants are growing, a sifted compost mix. So in order to create a soil compost mix, there's a few different ways. One way, which is probably more labor intensive, but something I learned from Don Daniel in Las Cañadas cooperative in Veracruz. In a wheelbarrow, he would take soil from the land and he would take the compost that he makes and do a 50-50 mix, first laying down the compost or the soil and then laying down the other on top, and then creating a space at the tip of the wheelbarrow and then moving through the whole wheelbarrow, turning it all the way one way and then all the way back. And that way it would be thoroughly mixed through by hand and having this very consistent mixture of soil and compost. And sifted compost for sure is great if you're looking to grow seedlings or things like that, putting that in your mixtures because it is finer. And so for delicate baby plant roots, they definitely prefer that. Other ways in which people can apply compost is if you have a lot of compost, you could also just spread it out on a field or in your growing area and then rake it in. And, it's usually recommended applying like an inch to a few inches of compost every season if you are intensively farming these areas. If you maybe do not have that much compost, another possibility is when you are transplanting, you can put some compost at the base that you are wanting to grow your plants and just mix it in. A couple of resources that I want to share is definitely the New York City Master Composter Manual, which is such an amazing resource for composting. Totally recommend it. As well as there's this book called Easy Compost, which provides a lot of tips as well. Thank you so much for tuning into our workshop as to how we compost over here at BK Rot. I hope you enjoyed learning some things and remembering that composting is something that is in your lineage. It is something that is part of the earth. It is within you and reflected around you. And I hope that y'all enjoy the process of transforming. And yeah, I also love sending prayers through compost, putting our intentions, releasing what we want to transform. So I invite y'all to join us in that process and start composting from wherever you are. All right. Thanks, y'all. Take care.